Hello, my name is Ian. I'm an accessibility specialist, and what I have for you today is a look at the current state of the industry in the form of an overview of some of the interesting things that have been happening in the field of accessibility over the past year. And the past year, well, the past 6 months in particular, has been quite a time for everyone, and accessibility has been affected as well. There have been a ton of really nice initiatives and projects that have either been cancelled or postponed because of the virus, because of the organisational impact of the virus and the financial impact of the virus on companies all over the world. And one sector in particular that has been hit hard, and not just in gaming but across all industries, has been the charitable sector, primarily through the loss of the face-to-face, in-person fundraising activities that they rely on. This is a list of just some of the charitable organisations working in the gaming and disability field. All of these organisations do incredible work. The industry would not be where it is today without them, and the gaming community wouldn't be where it is today without them either. So if it is within your means to donate, please consider doing so, helping to support the missions of these organisations, because it really is their hour of need. Despite the setbacks, there has still been a ton of really nice stuff happening over the past year. So I'm going to give you an overview of a few key themes that progress has been felt in, starting with hardware. There's been some nice progress made on input devices. So this is an example of that. What you're looking at here is a device called the 3D Rudder. It's been around for a little while. It's basically a big foot pad that you can use for controlling VR or gaming in general. Basically using your feet to operate it like a big analog stick. And this year, what you can see on the screen here is a set of straps and attachments to actually allow it to be controlled just using a single foot. Another nice example, and this is something that launched towards the end of last year. This is an adapter for the PlayStation 4 controller. It adds two configurable buttons onto the back of the device. So this isn't something that's to be used by developers. This doesn't add extra buttons, it adds alternative buttons. So they act in exactly the same way as the paddles on the back of an Xbox Elite controller and that kind of thing. Where basically it allows people who, from a disability perspective, might find it physically difficult to click in the sticks, or physically difficult to bend their fingers around to operate the triggers, now actually have that extra bit of flexibility to move some of those difficult controls to an area of the control that might work better for them. And this is for I think $30, about £25. So this is a really nice, cheap way of adding some extra flexibility to the controller. Next up, the Freedom Wing adapter. This was a collaboration between an organisation called AT Makers and the Able Gamers charity in the USA. Specifically, Steve Spawn of Able Gamers. This is his baby. And this is actually Steve that you're looking at in the photo now. Steve uses a powered chair, and at the top you can see the stick of his powered chair being operated by his hands. The signals from that stick are being sent down to the green box, which is the Freedom Wing. From there they're being sent onto the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which can then be picked up as a regular game controller. So Steve is actually in this photo playing Rocket League using the controller, using the joystick on his powered chair. And the last one for hardware, this really blew my mind when this came out. This is Logitech's adaptive gaming kit. So it's a collection of accessibility switches, and accessibility switches, they were actually my route into accessibility in the first place. It's basically alternative input devices used by people who can't use traditional ones like a mouse, a keyboard, or a game controller. And all they are is basically a 3.5mm mini jack on one end. On the other end, anything that closes a circuit that sends a simple on-off signal, hence the name switches. And they can take any kind of form. They can be anything from a big button on the table in front of you, to a button on your wheelchair headrest, to a tube to blow into, an infrared blink detector. It's a really, really nice, simple system with a really broad implications and applications. And it's that technology, those accessibility switches, that the Xbox Adaptive Controller was designed to work with. Accessibility switches, though, can be really expensive. They start at around £25 or so for one single button, and go upwards from that very, very quickly. And this adaptive gaming kit that Logitech brought out, this contains about a dozen or so switches of different sizes and configurations, designed specifically to be used with the Xbox Adaptive Controller, but because it's an open standard, it's actually useful for all kinds of applications, from controlling smart homes to in schools and all kinds of stuff. And they released this for £75. That would normally get you 3 switches of the most basic, cheapest switches, and this is a whole set of like a dozen of them, including analog triggers and mounting boards as well. It's an incredible democratization of access to this kind of assistive technology. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Assistive technology is not just in gaming, but everywhere, is still really, really expensive. But this being dropped down to £75, and the adaptive controller itself, before the adaptive controller came out, the closest equivalent to it cost about, I think, about £350. So being able to get a full set of a dozen or so switches plus the adapter itself for £150, that's still expensive, but that shaves a massive amount of the financial barrier that there is to using this kind of technology. So next up, platforms and middleware. So we're approaching an exciting time for platforms, because obviously we're about to see the launch of the new PlayStation and Xbox consoles. There has been very, very little information yet about what kind of accessibility functionality those are going to include, but there is some huge potential, because it was only really in about 2015 or so that we started to see accessibility features appearing on consoles, in part driven by legislation that kicked in around that time. That was part of the way through that console generation, but back in 2015 or so, the current generation would have been in very early stages of development. So what we're now going to see is really the first time ever that platforms are being developed in an environment where accessibility is thoroughly aware of and part of the culture. So how much they're able to deliver on that potential remains to be seen, but there is exciting potential, at least anyway, and I guess more will be revealed in the coming weeks. But even though things have kind of slowed down a bit in the lead up to the next generation, there still has been some nice stuff going on in the current generation. First of which being this is remapping in the Nintendo Switch. System level remapping that applies across all games. It's really, really nice, really powerful. You can even set it up so that everything can be operated just with a single Joy-Con. But there is a big caveat with this, which is that this is for something for players to use. It's a fallback for players for games that don't have remapping. It's not a fallback for developers to use. So if there's anybody watching this thinking, oh amazing, the system takes care of it, I don't have to care about remapping, you do. In-game remapping is much better for a whole ton of different reasons. So please, and this is not just from me, Xbox say this all the time about their own system level remapping functionality. You need to be thinking about remapping in your own games as well. This is another nice one. So this, I think, came in the February system update for the Xbox One. This is the ability to customize where you would like the notifications to appear. So, notifications that pop up if like you get an achievement or one of your friends is online, that kind of thing. And this might seem quite a basic thing, but until this was patched in, the location where the notifications appeared was in the middle at the bottom. That's where subtitles are. So just this tiny little tweak of being able to configure the location you want to be in is actually going to make a really enormous difference to the experience of loads of players. And this, bear with me, sorry, I've been a bit ill, I'm losing my voice. So this, for me, was the biggest news of the year out of anything in this whole presentation. This was a Reddit AMA in which Stadia revealed that they were implementing platform level certification requirements for accessibility, meaning that if any developer wants to release a game on Stadia, then there's going to be a bunch of accessibility requirements that have to be met to be able to launch. This is huge. Last time you saw anything remotely like this was all the way back in the Sega Saturn days. So the Saturn actually had certain requirements for remapping. All games had to remapping. All games also had to have like a mono audio toggle. But there's been nothing since then. So this is a really, really big deal. And I would be astounded if this didn't drive the conversation around these kind of issues, you know. I'd be surprised if there aren't people at the other platforms who are looking at what Stadia are doing and wondering about how applicable that might be for themselves as well. This is the new input system for Unity. This has been in the work for years and it is finally here. And the basic principle is to abstract out inputs from actions, which in turn makes implementing remapping much easier. It's still got a bit of a way to go. There's some ways it could be improved. If you have thoughts on that, Unity are very, very interested in hearing feedback on accessibility, so drop them a line. Oh, something else I mentioned actually, I'm not including URLs for the kind of stuff I'm showing here. It's all very easily Googleable, but if there's anything that you want a direct link to, my contact details will be at the end. Just drop me a link and drop me an email and I'll send it over. Next up, this is a biggie. This is screen reader support. So screen readers are a bit of software that people who are blind or have low vision, a couple other people for their reasons as well, basically use to access technology through speaking out the text that's on the screen. This is something that there has finally been some progress on in games. In other industries it's taken for granted, like you open up pretty much any website and it just automatically works out of the box, and pretty much any native app. Games not so much. It's starting to change now. There are games now that have voiced menus, in part driven by legislation, the same legislation I mentioned earlier. But it has been kind of like complicated bespoke efforts and manually interfacing with APIs and all that kind of stuff. That's now starting to change. Both Unity and Unreal have been working on native engine level cross-platform screen reader support, which is what engines are there for, right? To handle how your content renders for all those different platforms. So basically taking the textual info within an interface and also additional metadata around that. So for example, that it's a volume slider, that it is a 40%, that kind of stuff. Passing that out to each different system's text-to-speech technology. And then if a particular platform doesn't have its own built-in technology, it can then step in and just provide it itself through synthesis. So the short version of this is that it is going to get a whole lot easier for developers to implement this kind of stuff. They're both kind of work in progress at the moment. Unreal's is a little bit further along. That's actually released for people to play around with. It's an experimental preview build, so they don't really recommend using it for commercial releases quite yet, but somebody has. That's what you're looking at here, the Master Chief collection, that actually used that functionality for ensuring that the entirety of its menus were compatible with screen readers. And I think that's the first time that a AAA game has ever had screen reader accessibility. There have been a few, like I was saying, that have text-to-speech support, but actually interfacing directly with the screen reader software that blind people already use to access their technology, that's a first. And that's something that I'm looking forward to seeing a lot more of. So changing tack a bit, let's talk about information. Information in two areas: information for developers and information for gamers. So first off, kind of straddling the two, Can I Play That is a web resource for gamers. It reviews games for accessibility to help people make informed purchase decisions about whether a game is actually going to work for them or not. On top of that, they have now expanded out into developing these accessibility reference guides, building on all their own personal experiences, their experiences reviewing games as well. Really nice how-to guides for the kind of things to consider for different types of impairment. This is APX, Accessible Player Experiences. This is a training program that's run by Able Gamers over in the USA. This has actually been around for a little while, but what's new is an initiative that they've actually just recently started for marginalized developers. So anytime they run a training session, whether it is in person like here or remotely as it is at the moment, a certain number of seats are reserved for developers from marginalised backgrounds, and those seats are given to them for free. And that training can be quite expensive, so that's a big deal. Another really nice source of knowledge and information is this. This is a set of videos produced by Microsoft. If you have a look on the Microsoft Enable YouTube channel, there's a playlist of videos specifically on gaming accessibility. Really nice animated shorts, nice little bites of information. Each one's only about like 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes long. Really nice. Really good balance of kind of like the breadth and the depth of the content. I'd really recommend checking them out. This is something else from Microsoft. This is the Xbox Accessibility Guidelines. These have actually been around for quite a while. It's an internal resource that's been used by their internal studios, and some of the results of that have been seen in their recent games. What they've now done is made that publicly available, given this away as a free resource for other companies, other developers to use in development of their own games. And similarly to those animated shorts, it's a really nice balance of kind of breadth of content and depth of content. So same deal, I'd really recommend checking these out. On to information for gamers. So this year was the year that Game Accessibility Nexus launched. Game Accessibility Nexus is a review site, so in exactly the same way that I was talking about with Can I Play That? This is now joining Can I Play That and Data System and Game Critics in filling that really vital function for the gaming community of actually giving people the information they need to know whether or not a game is even going to be playable for them. Something similar but slightly different is the Family Video Game Database, and this also launched in the past year. The goal of this is slightly different. The primary function is to provide information to families about the age suitability of games. But as part of that, they also provide a ton of information on accessibility. So this information is provided in part by the guy who runs the site, but he also has a small army of accessibility helpers who help him populate that information about games as well. This is something slightly different. Again, exactly the same high-level goal of making sure that players have the information they need to make informed purchase decisions, but this time the information is populated by the developers themselves. This is the storefront for Stadia. Every single game on the Stadia storefront has an area on there dedicated to accessibility information. And this is something that I really hope we see more of. It's something that there has been some moves towards in the past. Itch has a load of accessibility filters, again populated by developers. Steam actually has it to a small degree. There was a change.org petition a few years back by a woman in Manchester. She's deaf. She said that basically there's no way at all that I can have any idea whether a game is going to be accessible to me until after I spend the money. So this petition was successful. Actually, even within a matter of weeks after launching the petition, Steam had implemented tick boxes for developers to tick for whether or not their game has subtitles and captions and which languages those are available in. And those actually make their way through to being filters in the storefront as well. So you can actually say, only show me games that have subtitles in English, for example. And something a little bit more detailed now. So this really started to make itself felt the previous year. studios who are starting to publish more in-depth posts detailing the kind of accessibility considerations that are present in their games. But that's gone from strength to strength now. In the past year, what has really changed is, well, two things. First of all, the depth of information being provided, going beyond just like simple bullet points and actually talking a bit about kind of like the design process and theory and stuff behind it. But also the stage at which the information is being provided. So you can see here, this is for Phoenix Rising. This is a detailed post about the accessibility functionality in the game. That's published in September. That's a full 3 months before the game is released. And this is so important. Often people don't get information about accessibility until after the game is launched. Often when they do get information before the game is launched, it's like 2 weeks before the game is launched. How much longer than that is hype building up for the game, if you want people to be carried along with the excitement and the build up to the launch of your game, they need to know if they're going to be able to play it. And part of that excitement, that journey and the build up to release of the game is video content, trailers, teasers, interviews, all that kind of stuff. And traditionally, video in the games industry, at the most, you might get some descriptive captions. Usually it's subtitles, and even then subtitles are by no means guaranteed. Have a look slightly sideways at other screen industries. Is a whole different ball game, including something called audio description. This is standard in other industries, and it's basically an additional audio track that can be enabled, and basically that audio track uses gaps in the dialogue and important sounds to insert some extra narration describing what is happening visually in the scene. Obviously super important for people who are blind, also low vision, also people with a range of cognitive impairments as well, who benefit from that extra reinforcement of what's happening in the scene. And this has finally started to appear, not in games, but in the media around games. And it's largely down to one person, a blind gamer and advocate specialist in the UK who goes by the name Sightless Combat. He gave a couple of really good conference talks about audio description, and that helped to drive, in particular, Ubisoft and Microsoft, who have been putting out a lot of audio described content for trailers and previews and that kind of thing. And I've seen a few people kind of asking the question of, well, our game isn't really blind accessible. Why would you produce an audio described trailer for a game that isn't blind accessible? And there's kind of a few answers to that. One is that all games are to some degree blind accessible. All games have sound, so it's more a question of how independently accessible a game is. Because there are a lot of blind gamers who play with assistance, whether that is remotely, whether it is locally over Copilot or just taking turns with the controller. Even people who are having to resort to currently sat there listening, engaging verbally with the content while somebody else is playing it for them, which isn't great. That's gradually changing. But either way, the point is basically that any game at all can have some degree of blind player base. And there's also some other reasons as well, like just the purely practical perspective of if you can actually get into the habit of providing this kind of functionality for your video content, that means you're getting used to the production pipeline. You have people and resources in place and stuff, so as your games gradually become more blind accessible, which is very strongly the way that things are going to be heading in the next year or two, that means you actually have that kind of knowledge and experience in place, so it'll be much easier to start integrating that kind of functionality in games for cutscenes and that kind of thing. And lastly, just the point of the statement that it makes, just of like I said, that you actually value people's excitement, people's engagement with your game, with your brand, and of how equally you value them. So next up, events. One thing there has been a lot of over the past year has been game jams, either solely about accessibility or with accessibility's extra criteria. One button game jam, blind game jam. This is the Crater Jam. Crater is a easy to use game development framework, and they held a game jam over the summer to build games using this framework. And the person who won the Crater Summer Game Jam is a girl called Becky. If any of you are familiar with special effects work on iGaze Minecraft, you might already be familiar with Becky. Becky is the person who Special Effect collaborated with for the development of that tool, for that iGaze Minecraft tool. And she actually won the game jam, so she is now a budding young game developer herself. And this game that won the game jam was developed solely using iGaze technology. For game jams though, the daddy really is Global Game Jam, and Global Game Jam every year has a set of accessibility criteria, optional accessibility criteria that are taken up by tens of thousands of developers all over the world, which is really valuable educational and awareness raising tool, because this is a lot of developers who are kind of early in their careers, or students who are taking away some really important lessons about what can be achieved, and not just how easy it is to deliver real value to your players, even just in the context of a couple of game jam. In the past year they took it a step further with the Accessibility Fund. This was thanks to a whole bunch of generous donors, companies around the games industry, who contributed money to this fund. That money was then sent around to people who requested it at physical game jam venues. That money can then be used to make improvements to the physical accessibility of those venues for disabled participants. And that interest in and understanding of physical accessibility is something that was a real strong theme in the past year and into the start of this year, with the kind of in-person things like conventions and conferences and things like E3 and Gamescom, EGX, that kind of thing, where people were putting a lot of effort into accessibility of their booths, accessibility of their announcements, all that kind of stuff. And that's something that has followed through into things moving online. Also, because of the virus, in-person events aren't too feasible at the moment, so things like Ubisoft Forward have been coming into existence, and these have been following through on those learnings about how to make events accessible. So providing things like live captioning, like audio description, like ASL and BSL signing. And something else that's been really nice with Ubisoft Forward in particular was actually sending preview builds of the games being demoed out to disabled review sites like the ones I mentioned, to disabled influencers, so that those people can actually have the dialogue with their communities directly about what these games have got to offer for them. And this is quite hot off the press. This was just a few weeks ago, this announcement. It's about the Game Awards. The Game Awards are, for this year, introducing a category for innovation in accessibility. There have been other awards in the past that have recognised work in accessibility, like the Tiger Awards in the UK and also the Australian Game Developer Awards. This is a whole other ballgame. So I think last year the viewing figures were way up in the tens of millions for this, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to be quite a bit higher now that we're all stuck at home. So those kind of viewing figures involved. It's great to recognise people who've been doing good work in the field, but it is also a really tremendous awareness raising opportunity. Letting people across the entire gaming community know about accessibility, know about what kind of innovation is out there, and also what value it is. And also kind of touching back on something that I mentioned earlier as well. It's a really powerful statement to make to people with disabilities, saying we not just recognise you exist, but we value you equally as consumers and as people. So that brings me neatly on to the games themselves. The game that has been getting all of the attention recently has been The Last of Us 2, and with very good reason. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But it hasn't all been about The Last of Us 2. There's been a ton of really incredible stuff happening across the industry. So this is the point at which I'm going to cheat and just read off a piece of paper. So this is a list of just some of the games. This is not exhaustive at all. Just some of the games that have been doing really nice stuff for accessibility in the past year. Ghost Recon Breakpoint, Minecraft EDU, Jedi Fallen Order, Vacation Simulator, Lost Ember, Hyperdot, Trine 4, Cook Serve Delicious 3, Dreams, Scourgebringer, Veritas, Path of Giants, Zombie Army 4, Darksiders Genesis, Bleeding Edge, Moving Out, Doom Eternal, Lair of the Clockwork God, Freedom Finger, Half-Life Alyx, Predator Hunting Grounds, Gears Tactics, Minecraft Dungeons, Before I Forget, Sea of Thieves, Space Wave Race, Jet Lancer, Wildfire, Destiny 2, Last of Us 2, Chicken Police, Boots on the Moon, Hades, Center Showdown, Spin Rhythm, Paradise Killer, Overcooked, Ghost of Tsushima, Grounded, Hyperscape, Avengers, Control, Untold, Tell Me Why, Phenotopia, Wasteland 3, Going Under, X-Tays, Scarlet Hollow, and the Tony Hawk's remakes. That is an incredible list to be able to read out. Looking back at just where things were, even 2 years ago, that is an amazing amount of progress to get to that point. And it's covering all areas of the industry, all scales of company, all over the world, including a ton of UK representation on that list, which is really nice to see. But back to Last of Us 2. The Last of Us 2 has done a ton of really nice work, including a strong focus on blind and low vision, high contrast modes, fully voiced menus, navigational assistance, a nice sonar system. And what's really nice about it is that you might think that designing a game to be accessible to people who are completely blind is some pretty niche stuff. It's actually not. There's nothing in there that they put in there that makes the game completely accessible to blind people that isn't also useful for other players as well. So I'd really recommend, if you haven't already, have a tinker around with the kind of stuff they put in that game. It's really nice. And the way they did it was by, well, firstly making use of the 3 pillars of game accessibility. There's basically 3 tools at your disposal for understanding the shape of a problem. One of which is making use of existing guidelines and good practices, like some of the things I mentioned to you before. The next is making use of expert advice. They worked with a whole bunch of experts and consultants. And also the third one is user research, so working directly with the community, bringing them in, learning from their experiences. What tied all that stuff together and made all that stuff possible was the fact that they thought about accessibility early. It had its roots in Uncharted 4. Uncharted 4 was their previous game, and it's a bit like what I was saying with what's happening with the consoles, that towards the end of Uncharted 4's development, a couple of people on the team started pushing for a couple of things, and it was really nice what they managed to do. But their reaction, which is the same that everybody always has, is, oh my god, if only I'd thought about this earlier, there's so much more that we could have done. We could have done so much of a better job. So for the next game, that's what they did. When at the end of Uncharted 4's development, Last of Us 2 was still in quite early stages, so they were able to think about accessibility really early and develop some stuff that wouldn't really been possible to do late in development, and other things that would have been possible were still much easier and much cheaper to do as well. Lastly, hires. So all this stuff that I've been talking about, all these games, they're only possible because of people. And traditionally, this has always been kind of a combination of pressure coming from outside and people on the inside who, I'm sure this is going to sound really familiar to a lot of people watching this, people who already have a regular full-time day job and are desperately trying to squeeze in bits of accessibility here and there around there. That has been slowly changing. So there are now round about, I think, 30 or so people throughout the industry for whom accessibility is their sole job, their sole responsibility. This has traditionally been people who kind of were in that position of like trying to shoehorn accessibility in, and it gradually became more and more their official responsibility. But what we've seen in the past year is actually the birth of accessibility as an actual advertised position. So I think up until this year, there was one single example, which was Brandon Zahand at Xbox. His role was publicly advertised. This year we've had Cherry Thompson join Ubisoft. That was another advertised role. Another one for Riot. Enid started there just a couple of months ago. And Unity didn't advertise for an accessibility role though. They advertised for an accessibility team. So they now actually have a whole team dedicated solely to accessibility, and they're looking at it from two different sides as well. The first side is looking at accessibility of the development environment itself, to try and make that more accessible to disabled developers. Then the other side to it is looking at ways that they can enable accessibility from the developer side, like kind of tools and stuff that they can put in place to take care of some of the heavy lifting and make it easier for developers to do a good job of accessibility. And want to hear from developers about that. If you've got any thoughts at all on either of those sides, please get in touch with them. They really want to hear from you. So I think that's a nice positive note to end on. I think you can see from the kind of stuff we've been talking about, what we've got in place now is a really solid foundation. There's still a long way to go. We're still a very long way off from a point where a gamer can pick up any given game and have a reasonable expectation that even the basics will be taken care of. Things like remapping, color blindness, decent subtitling, text size, effects intensity. I'm still yet to see, like a big name game that's even managed to get all those basics right. I'm confident the next year is going to be when it happens, but the point being, there's still a long way to go, but at least we have got solid foundations in place now. So if you've liked what you've seen, whether you are already working accessibility and have the potential to do more, or whether you're not yet and are now feeling like you might want to jump in, please do. Please be part of this wave and help to drive the industry to an ever better place. Thank you.